Welcome to the Method Podcast. I'm Aidan Simpson, and this is where we talk to designers at Google about work, life, and the future of design.
One of the roughest, cheapest ways we used to do sentiment analysis was by checking the amount of profanity that we were getting in user data. We were literally running scripts to check the recognition logs for profanity, because when people are swearing, it tells us they're unhappy.
For this episode, I turned over interviewing duties to interaction designer Travis Neilson, who works on the search team. Travis interviewed Margaret Urban, a linguist, writer, and conversation designer working on the Google Assistant. Margaret dives into the complex details of creating voice user interfaces and ways that designers can make computers sound more like people. So that's enough from me. Let's get into it.
My name is Margaret Urban. I'm a voice user interface designer here at Google in search on the Assistant.
And what is the hardest thing about what you're doing?
The fact that language is built into our human experience to such a degree that we don't even understand its complexity. Most of the time, most people walking around don't understand the complexity of it. So the metaphor I use for this all the time is the fish does not think about the water, right? We are born, we grow up with language around us, we absorb it, we produce it, we get kind of corrections along the way in subtle and not so subtle ways. You know, I don't mean your 8th grade English teacher, but I mean when your parents tell you that that's not just a big dog, that's a horse, or when they say it's not foots, it's feet. And so you kind of absorb these rules about how language works just through osmosis and interaction with the world. So it is generally not something that people are consciously aware of. And making the water visible to the fish is our job within Google, but making the water smooth and friction-free for the user is what we want to do outside Google.
Computers and humans speak very differently, like not just a different language, but the way we organize our thinking.
Well, the only reason computers speak differently to people is that people who are writing what the computers say are making assumptions about that presentation of information. What we should do is speak the user's language. So understanding the structure and the context and the pragmatics, so how language is used in the social context, is really important in creating something that sounds natural to a human, because we want the computers to talk like people. We don't want to force the people to talk like computers,
right,
even though that's what we've been doing to them for the past 20 years.
We've been speaking like humans a lot longer than we've been speaking like computers.
Yes, exactly.
As a race, right?
Yeah.
So in your own way, how did you learn what humans speak like? You know, like how did you become outside of the water looking at all the fish in the water?
Well, I've been fascinated by language all my life. I think it's magical. I think I mentioned I was speaking to one of my colleagues earlier, and she said it's like telepathy, that I can simply by the vibration of a sound wave put an idea in your head. I can make you think of purple elephants just by saying this acoustic string, purple elephants. And so that part is magic, that we have actually learned to get from my little 3-pound brain to your 3-pound brain using this system, this tool that humans have come up with. So I mentioned I've been fascinated with language ever since I was small. And I've always been interested in learning languages. You know, I started out with French and Latin, and then I got really excited by Tolkien's Elvish, and I wrote really bad Tolkien Elvish poetry in high school, of course. I still write the script. I learned Arabic and Japanese, well, bits of Arabic and bits of Japanese, because again, completely different language families to the other languages I studied, French and German and obviously English. And I just have always wanted to know how people get meaning across and why they couch it in various ways. So, for instance, an alphabet has different ways of representing sounds. Is that important? Is that something that's meaningful? And all the ways that people communicate with all the channels at our command are also relevant to how we communicate linguistically. So when we're doing multimodal design, we have to remember that people use their hands, they use their faces, they use their breath, just sighing or responding in all kinds of ways. And so I just started learning about this probably when I was an undergraduate. I was an English lit major, but I did it with a sort of linguistic bent. So I was interested in the way that Scottish Gaelic syntax and imagery was encoded in English language Scottish literature. And then, if I fast forward a couple of years, I was working as an editor for children's books and for textbooks. And as part of that job, I knew that my best work was done when I was completely invisible. If nobody even knew that there was an editor, right? And they would just be able to get from the book the content that they needed without ever having to think about the format. And that's exactly the same job I do now. I try to become invisible because when somebody has a conversation with the Google Assistant, I don't want them to think about somebody writing a really bad prompt. I want them to just have that experience and have it be frictionless and have it be enjoyable, successful, fulfilling, delightful, whatever the context of their request is. I want that to be achieved.
So you've been in human-computer interaction using
for
speech
one college student's lifetime, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the length of one freshman or maybe sophomore college student.
Okay.
Yeah, which is pretty stunning to me every time I think about those numbers. And the amazing part is, back then we were struggling with some of the same issues we struggle with today, which is how do we make it natural given the constraints of our technology? And the recognition wasn't as good back then. There were other problems with networks and provisioning of systems that thankfully we don't have here at Google, but there's other things that are still challenges to us today. Humans interrupt each other all the time in big and little ways. And in a lot of cases, it's just an acknowledgement of the other person's ongoing content, but sometimes it's taking the floor, taking the turn away. But we don't have the ability to have that natural turn taking yet. So we still rely on sort of a user says a thing and Google says a thing. And then user says a thing, and Google says a thing, which frankly isn't that natural. So we're still working on various challenges here that have been always in the industry.
That's really interesting. Barging in is one example of making a computer act like a human, right? Respecting somebody, kind of adding input mid-conversation. You mentioned earlier that there's other kind of signals that are not native to computers, like a sigh, or maybe elevating their voice, or talking faster.
Yes.
Things like,
These are signals. These are fascinating signals. There's a lot of work being done in sentiment analysis. And that is important to understand because one of the roughest, cheapest ways we used to do sentiment analysis was by checking the amount of profanity that we were getting in user data. We were literally running scripts to check the recognition logs for profanity because when people are swearing, it tells us they're unhappy. It would be nicer to do that in a slightly more intelligent and sensitive way, right? So you look at things like rate of speech. You look at other lexical items as well. You look at some syntactic patterns. So when people are feeling very polite and friendly, they're going to use more words. They're going to use more hedges, like, would you be so kind as to open the door for me? I've got this big box. If you're really cross with somebody and you just want them to get out of the way, you're probably going to say something like move, you know? So you use shorter imperative sentences, things like that. We haven't built that into our dialogue systems yet, but it's the kind of thing that will teach us to be a little bit more subtle about how we handle things. Right now, we kind of have a one-size-fits-all approach. If somebody says something that fits within a kind of generalized intent bucket, we have a prompt that plays back to that. But wouldn't it be pretty if we knew that somebody was in a hurry because of the way they're talking? So we chose the shorter response based on their speaking to us in a short way. And that's another way that we can make computers act a little bit more like people. When people are talking to each other, we have this phrase in the biz that goes, interlocutors assimilate, which means people that are talking to each other become more like each other. So for instance, you're going to use shorter sentences if the person you're speaking with is using shorter sentences. You might speak faster if they are. You might go down to a whisper if they're going down to a whisper, or you might even shout at them. It happens in arguments, right? Louder and louder on both sides. So the more that we could respond and assimilate to our users in a sensitive way and understand why the context that they're in is making them do something, the better and more conversational we can be and the better we can respond.
Yeah. This is so fascinating, and I can resonate with what you're saying because I use language every day. You know, it's intuitive, and you have to like make a map for what I feel is intuitive and kind of sort that all out. Is this difficult to explain to somebody who's not really in kind of like the tech space?
I think one of the best things we can do is provide good examples. I sort of see the words that we pass back and forth between ourselves in the air. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. And then there's all this computation and kind of understanding of language and the world that goes on underlyingly in our brains that we're not conscious of. So when we think about just the words that are going back and forth, it seems simple, but then you realize there's a lot more to it. So the example that we were discussing earlier was the film Arrival, which had a great linguistics dialogue design teaching moment in it, where they say, well, can't you just ask them what their purpose is here on Earth? And she says, well, yeah, but there's a few things you have to back up and understand first. So they need to know what the idea of a question is. We need to be able to define what you means. Is it you, the individual, or is it you, a collective? Is it you, the beings on the ship, or is it you, your planet? And then intentions and purposes, that's something that even humans have a hard time kind of abstracting and understanding. It takes children a long time to understand what intent is, as opposed to just actually concrete objects in the world. So yeah, once you start to unpack these examples, it makes people realize what's going on underneath.
I imagine training computers to talk is maybe a lot like training aliens to talk.
Yes, and sometimes it feels more alien than you can imagine. Yeah, it seems like under every rock there's another rock, or you know, it's like turtles all the way down, because there is always more complexity to unpack, and we know that we can't do everything all at once. We know we have to kind of choose our battles and make progress towards that destination, but we also have to understand what the right kinds of projects and successes are that we can do now that will not put people off. Mm-hmm. One of the challenges with the interface side of a voice experience is that because users have the same built-in expectations about language that we've been discussing, they have a much higher bar for voice systems than they have for, say, a telephone screen or a browser. I mean, we've all gone to web pages that are utterly horrible, and we just laugh at them. And after a while, you might find the link you're looking for or the sequence of clicks you have to do. But when there's a voice system involved, people have these beliefs about how it should work based on their growing up using language intuitively. And if it fails, it's more disappointing and more sort of damaging to their experience, and they're less likely to try again with a voice system. So our job is to not drive people away as much as it is to engage and fulfill their intents. We have to make sure we're not breaking their expectations.
Wow. I guess I never really thought of that there are types of communication that humans are really attuned to and sensitive to. For example, when I'm designing on digital surfaces, I can fudge a color maybe, or I can make a type size a little bit bigger or smaller. Nobody would really notice, but if I screw up the motion of it, humans are very attuned to motion tracking.
Oh, yes.
So there would be a problem. And I'm just realizing now audio as well, right? Like that's a very primary sense that we use to understand the world around us.
Yes.
We hear a word pronounced a little differently, or the tense is wrong maybe, and we'll be like, haha, it's not smart.
Well, it's funny you should say that. We talk about reducing cognitive load. Mm-hmm. So that just means making the user work less hard, because ease of effort is a really good determiner of whether people are going to enjoy using a system. And it turns out that cognitive load is physically real. So you mentioned tense in a sentence, like if we run into a tense that's wrong. It is literally true that if you've got this basically electricity measuring cap on somebody's head as they're listening to sentences, and you say something like, the birds that I saw in the swamp was white. The minute you get to the word was, the brain kind of spins up in a little extra cycle going, Was is singular. Why is that was? The birds were plural. Birds are plural. Was is singular. What is this? I guess it really is just meant to be a verb of to be, and it just happens to not match. Okay, I'll go along with the white. So it's not that the meaning of the sentence is totally lost, but it means that your brain works harder in parsing and understanding what that meaning was. And so any time that we can reduce that that cognitive load, we know that we're actually making it like literally easier,
right.
physically easier for users. And I loved what you said about like listening to the audio. So I just spent 6 hours in the recording studio this week recording a whole bunch of prompts. I'm one of the VUI designers who coaches the voice actor when she's going through various prompts for various applications. And one of the things we really have to pay attention to is that prosodic structure, like the melody, the variation in how she says things makes all the difference. So, for instance, questions, you want, like a yes or no question, you want to sort of have generally a rising thing, like, do you want fish? But if there's an either or kind of example, you have to be careful about how that gets presented. So you don't want her to say, do you want fish or cheese? Because the user might be fooled into sort of answering the first half of the question before they hear the second half of the question. Or there's subtle things like if we said, did I get that right? That little bit of extra contrast on the word that sort of implies that there is something else that we didn't get right, and that this is in contrast to that. So we have to avoid bringing up possible alternate meanings in the listener's head when we're playing audio to them.
In order to reduce cognitive load.
Indeed.
In preparation for this interview, I watched this really, really cool and helpful video. It's like 3 minutes. And one of the things I learned was that as people are having conversations, they're continually building and destroying and rebuilding mental models of what is actually being communicated, and checking their intent against those models to make sure that they understand the conversation as it happens in real time. I never thought about that, right? Because I just do it.
Exactly. It's totally natural. But in the same way that when you are visiting a foreign city, you're sort of trying it on for size. You walk around going, what would it be like to live here? I would go to that coffee shop every single day, 5 times a day. I would eat baguettes or whatever it is. And in a conversation, we do the same thing. We're trying every utterance and every kind of nuance and new piece of meaning on and saying, does this fit my intention? Does my intention fit the new state of this conversation? What modifications do I need to make? But we're doing that totally under the hood. Meanwhile, you're really actually just talking about like the price of lobster or something along those lines.
That is blowing my mind. Right? Can you define the word VUI?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, VUI is our shorthand for voice user interface.
I just wanted to make sure
and
everybody
we go
caught
back
that.
and forth. Yeah. We talk about conversation design. We talk about VUI design. We talk about dialogue design. They're all shades of the same thing. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we use one, so we use VUI because it's shorthand that everybody in our sort of sphere knows, but conversation design is the phrase we like to use when we're trying to remind people that it's about that bigger human conversation that's going on, whereas VUI can sound like technical, it's a technical acronymy little thing, right? And dialogue design got a bad rap in the early 2000s because it also seemed to be constrained to sort of little modular dialogues that could be, again, plugged and played. And that's not how language works. You can't just sort of uplift one bit and stick something else in its place. I also have a background in music, and you find a lot of people with music and mathematics and computer science are language people too. There's these really strong correlations. And language itself contains music, right? The prosody I was talking about before, the melodies of speech, you have to be sensitive to them, and you have to understand not just the artistic nature of them, but also the ways they carry meaning, because a prosodic melody will in fact carry meaning all by itself. If you heard somebody mumbling through a wall and you heard you'd know they were asking a question, even though you don't even know what words they're using or what the syntax is. So there's all of these ways where I think my background, whether it's accidental or deliberate in study, has come into play.
Wow. And what do you see that's coming that you're really excited about?
We are trying to take that longer view and think about what the assistant can really become. And it's so tremendously exciting to think not about movies like Her, that really still is a Hollywood thing, but just in the ways that in our real world, with the technology that we have at our disposal, we can have an assistant that is communicative, supportive, useful, friendly, funny, helpful, like all the things that you can get from a human person that you're speaking with. And we're not pretending that she's human. We're not pretending that there's a person on the other end of the line. So we're walking this fine line. And doing that kind of balancing act is exciting in itself, but also seeing what the possibilities are for what we're creating is amazing.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And
it's been great to chat about this.
Yeah, we have a little bit of the space if you want to kind of give a message about where they can learn more about VUI and about specifically your team and the work that you guys are doing.
Yeah, sure. So one of the great things about this year was that 4 talks from the conversation design team were included at I.O., and they're all available from the I.O. events page. I would especially, just for sheer beauty and entertainment value, I would start with James Jangola's talk. It's something like How to Apply Built-in Hacks of Conversation to Your Voice User Interface Design.
It's a great title.
Yeah, it is. Well, and what he's doing is pointing out that there's all these great things already built into language that if you put them into your design, will give it that much more naturalness and more fluidity and really save you from sounding like robo-speak. But also, Nandini Stalker, Daniel Paget, and Jared Strotterman, also in our team, had really great talks.
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, just a final word from us at Google Design. We're launching a new weekly email digest for designers. The Google Design Download is a fun roundup of our top stories and favorite tools with a delightful download in every email. You can sign up at design.google/subscribe. If you want to know more information about the things we talked about in the show, check out the show notes at design.google/podcasts. And please subscribe to Method on Google Play, iTunes, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This episode was produced by Barbara Eldridge, edited and mixed by Brian Gordon, and skillfully hosted and recorded by Travis Neilson in Mountain View, California. That's it from us.